In the autumn of 1347, as merchants unloaded their cargo from Genoese ships in the bustling ports of Europe, they carried with them more than silk and spices from distant lands. Hidden among the grain sacks and trade goods, an invisible terror had crossed the Mediterranean. Within months, this microscopic passenger would transform the very fabric of medieval civilization, leaving behind a trail of devastation so complete that survivors would struggle to comprehend the world they had inherited. The Black Death stands as perhaps the most catastrophic pandemic in human history. Between 1347 and 1353, this merciless plague swept across Europe like a dark tide, claiming the lives of an estimated 75 to 200 million people. To put this staggering loss into perspective, imagine if every third person you know simply vanished from existence. Entire villages were abandoned, their streets echoing only with the sound of wind through empty doorways. Great cities that had thrived for centuries saw their populations cut in half virtually overnight. But this is more than a story of death and despair. The Black Death represents one of history's great turning points, a moment when the medieval world died and something entirely new was born from its ashes. The plague didn't merely kill people, it killed an entire way of life. The rigid feudal system that had defined European society for centuries crumbled as surely as the bodies piled in mass graves. Peasants who had lived their entire lives bound to the land suddenly found themselves with power they had never imagined. The Catholic Church, which had provided spiritual certainty for generations, faced a crisis of faith as prayers proved powerless against the advancing pestilence. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let us journey back to those dark years when death walked openly through the world. We'll witness the panic in Constantinople as the first plague ships arrived from the distant steppes of Central Asia. We'll walk the silent streets of Florence, where the great poet Boccaccio watched his beloved city transform into a charnel house. We'll stand with the desperate doctors in their bizarre beaked masks, futilely attempting to heal a disease they could not understand. And we'll observe how ordinary people, faced with the collapse of everything they had known, found ways to adapt, survive, and ultimately rebuild. The plague's origins lie shrouded in the mists of the Eurasian steppes, where nomadic peoples had lived for centuries in harmony with the natural reservoirs of a deadly bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This microscopic organism had evolved over millennia in the burrows of marmots and other rodents, maintained in a delicate ecological balance that posed little threat to human populations. But in the early 14th century, something changed. Perhaps it was climate fluctuations that drove infected rodents into closer contact with human settlements. Perhaps it was the expanding trade networks that created new pathways for disease transmission. Whatever the catalyst, the ancient equilibrium was shattered, and plague began its inexorable march westward. The earliest reliable reports of the devastating epidemic come from the shores of Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan, where Nestorian Christian tombstones from 1338 and 1339 bear inscriptions mentioning pestilence as the cause of death. From these remote mountain valleys, the plague followed the Silk Road trade routes, that vast network of commercial pathways that connected east and west. Caravans that had once carried precious goods now became unwitting vehicles of death, spreading the infection from oasis to oasis, city to city, as they pursued their ancient patterns of commerce. By the mid-1340s, the plague had reached the thriving commercial centres of the Crimean Peninsula. Here in the bustling port city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, the disease would take a dramatic leap that would seal Europe's fate. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony, one of many European footholds along the Black Sea coast that facilitated the lucrative trade between East and West. The city's cosmopolitan population included Italian merchants, local Greeks, Armenian traders, and Mongol officials, all drawn together by the promise of profit in this crossroads of civilizations. In 1346, Kaffa found itself under siege by the army of Jani Beg, a commander of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that controlled much of the western steppe. What began as a conventional military campaign soon transformed into something far more sinister as plague began decimating the Mongol forces. Contemporary accounts describe how the besieging army was devastated by a mysterious disease that killed with terrifying speed. Soldiers who had awakened healthy in the morning were dead by nightfall, their bodies covered with the black swellings that would give the plague its eventual name. Rather than retreat in the face of this biological catastrophe, Jani Beg made a decision that would echo through history. In one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare, the Mongol commander ordered his men to catapult the plague-infected corpses of their fallen comrades over the walls of Kaffa. The intention was clear. If the Mongols could not take the city by conventional means, they would deliver death itself into the hands of their enemies. The horrified defenders of Kaffa watched as decomposing bodies rained down upon their streets and marketplaces. They quickly disposed of the corpses, throwing them into the sea or burning them in great pyres, but it was already too late. Whether through this macabre bombardment or through infected rats that had crossed the siege lines, plague had entered the city. Within weeks, Kaffa was experiencing the same devastating mortality that had broken the Mongol army. As the plague took hold, panic gripped the surviving population. The Genoese merchants, with their deep-hulled trading vessels, saw escape as their only option. In the summer of 1347, they loaded their ships with whatever goods they could salvage and fled westward across the Black Sea. They carried with them more than trade goods and personal possessions. Hidden in the grain stores and cargo holds of their vessels, black rats harboured fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the microscopic agent that would soon bring Europe to its knees. The plague's entry into Europe was as dramatic as its arrival in Kaffa, the first major European city to experience the full horror of the Black Death. Was Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire. In the late summer of 1347, as Genoese ships from Kaffa docked in the Golden Horn, they brought with them the seeds of catastrophe. Within weeks, the disease was spreading through the crowded neighbourhoods of the great city like fire through dry timber. Constantinople in 1347 was still one of the world's great urban centres, though much diminished from its former glory. The city that had once ruled the eastern Mediterranean now struggled to maintain its independence against increasing pressure from the Ottoman Turks. Its population, estimated at around 400,000, was crammed into the triangular peninsula between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara. The dense urban environment, with its narrow streets and crowded tenements, provided ideal conditions for the plague's rapid spread. The Byzantine Emperor, John VI Cantacuzene, left a haunting account of the plague's impact on his capital. Writing in deliberate imitation of the ancient historian Thucydides, who had described the plague of Athens nearly 2,000 years earlier, Cantacuzene documented how the disease spared no one. The imperial family itself was not immune. The emperor's 13-year-old son died of the plague, a personal tragedy that symbolized the helplessness of even the most powerful in the face of this invisible enemy. From Constantinople, Genoese ships carried the plague to every major port in the Mediterranean. Sicily was among the first to fall. In October 1347, 12 galleys from the east limped into the harbour of Messina. Contemporary chroniclers describe a horrifying scene. Most of the sailors were dead, and those still alive were covered with black boils and spitting blood. The Sicilian authorities, recognizing the danger, attempted to drive the ships away, but it was too late. The plague had already made the leap from ship to shore. The disease spread through Sicily with devastating speed. Palermo, Catania, and Syracuse fell in quick succession. The island's population, estimated at around 600,000, was reduced by perhaps half within a single year. Entire families were wiped out, leaving no one to bury the dead or tend to their property. Fields lay unharvested as their owners perished, and livestock wandered freely through abandoned villages. From Sicily, the plague leapt to the Italian mainland. The great commercial cities of the peninsula, with their extensive trade networks and dense populations, proved particularly vulnerable. Genoa, the very republic whose ships had carried the plague from Caffa, was among the first to suffer. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The city that had profited so greatly from Eastern trade now paid the ultimate price for its commercial success. Venice, Genoa's great rival, experienced similar devastation. The city's unique geography, built on a collection of islands in a shallow lagoon, might have seemed to offer some protection, but the plague showed no respect for natural barriers. It swept through the Venetian arsenal, the great shipyard that was the heart of the Republic's naval power, and penetrated the most exclusive neighbourhoods around St. Mark's Square. The Doge himself fell victim to the disease, as did many of the merchant princes who had made Venice one of Europe's wealthiest cities, but perhaps nowhere was the impact of the Black Death more thoroughly documented than in Florence, that jewel of Renaissance civilization. In 1347, Florence was at the height of its power and prosperity. The city's banks financed trade across Europe, its textile workshops produced the finest cloth in the world, and its artists and scholars were laying the foundations of what would become the Renaissance. The population, swollen by immigration from the surrounding countryside, had reached approximately 120,000, making it one of Europe's largest cities. When the plague arrived in Florence in the spring of 1348, it found ideal conditions for its spread. The city was densely packed, with tall buildings crowding narrow streets, and multiple families often sharing single rooms. The poor lived in squalid conditions in the workers' quarters, while even the wealthy resided in close proximity to their neighbours. Trade routes connected Florence to infected cities throughout the Mediterranean, ensuring that the disease would find multiple pathways into the heart of Tuscany. The great writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, left us one of the most vivid and detailed accounts of the Black Death's impact on urban life. In the introduction to his masterwork, the Decameron, Boccaccio described how the plague transformed his beloved city into a landscape of horror. He wrote of seeing the dead piled like goods in ships' holds, of families abandoning their sick relatives out of fear, and of the complete breakdown of social order that had previously governed Florentine society. According to Boccaccio, the plague manifested itself in terrifying physical symptoms that varied from person to person. Some victims developed large black swellings in their groin or under their arms, growths that he compared to apples or eggs in size. These buboes, as they came to be known, were excruciatingly painful and often burst, releasing foul-smelling pus. Other victims suffered from dark spots or blotches that appeared on their arms, thighs, and other parts of the body. These markings, which gave the plague one of its names, were usually a sign of impending death. The speed with which the plague killed was perhaps its most terrifying characteristic. Unlike other diseases that might linger for weeks or months, allowing families time to care for their loved ones and prepare for death, the Black Death often killed within days or even hours of the first symptoms appearing. Boccaccio noted that many people went to bed apparently healthy and were found dead the next morning. This rapid progression left no time for the elaborate death rituals that were so important to medieval society. As the plague tightened its grip on Florence, the normal functioning of society began to break down. The city's sophisticated system of guilds, which had regulated everything from banking to bread-making, found itself paralysed as key members died or fled. Churches that had served as community centres for centuries stood empty as priests either perished or abandoned their posts. The courts ceased to function, leaving legal disputes unresolved and contracts unfulfilled. Most shocking to contemporary observers was the collapse of family bonds that had been the bedrock of medieval society. Boccaccio described how fear of contagion led people to abandon their most fundamental obligations. Parents deserted sick children. Children fled from dying parents, and spouses left each other to face death alone. The normal rituals of mourning and burial, so essential to medieval Christian culture, became impossible to maintain as the sheer number of dead overwhelmed the living. The economic impact was equally devastating. Florence's banks, which had branches throughout Europe, found themselves unable to function as key personnel died, and communication networks broke down. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks, among the largest financial institutions in medieval Europe, had already been weakened by defaults on loans to English and French monarchs. The plague delivered the final blow, forcing them into bankruptcy and taking down the smaller institutions in their wake. The textile industry, which employed thousands of Florentines and generated much of the city's wealth, ground to a halt. The complex process of turning raw wool into finished cloth required coordination between many different craftsmen, from carders and spinners to weavers and dyers. As key workers died or fled, this intricate system collapsed. Workshops that had hummed with activity for generations fell silent, their looms gathering dust as their operators lay in hastily dug graves. By the time the plague finally began to subside in late 1348, Florence had been transformed beyond recognition. The population had fallen from 120,000 to perhaps 50,000, a decline of nearly 60%. Entire neighbourhoods stood empty, their houses sealed and abandoned. Grass grew in the streets where merchants had once conducted business, and wild animals ventured into the city centre in search of food. Yet even as Florence struggled to comprehend the magnitude of its loss, the plague was continuing its relentless march across Europe. From the Italian peninsula, it spread northward across the Alps into France and the German states. It travelled westward along the Mediterranean coast to Spain and Portugal, and it moved eastward through the Balkans toward Poland and Hungary. Everywhere it went, the pattern was the same. Initial denial, then panic, then the grim work of counting the dead and attempting to rebuild shattered communities. The plague's arrival in France marked another crucial phase in its European conquest. The Kingdom of France in 1348 was the largest and most populous in Western Europe, with an estimated 17 million inhabitants. It was also politically fragmented, as the ongoing 100 Years' War with England had created a patchwork of competing authorities and military campaigns that would aid the plague's spread. The first French city to experience the full impact of the Black Death was Marseille, the great Mediterranean port that connected France to the wider world of trade and commerce. Ships arriving from infected Italian ports brought the plague to Marseille's crowded harbour district in November 1347. From there, it spread rapidly through the city's narrow streets and crowded marketplaces. The city's population, estimated at around 25,000, was reduced by half within 6 months. From Marseille, the plague followed France's river systems and trade routes northward. It reached Avignon, seat of the papal court, in early 1348. The presence of the Pope and his vast bureaucracy had made Avignon one of Europe's most important cities, drawing pilgrims, merchants, and officials from across Christendom. The city's cosmopolitan population and constant flow of visitors created ideal conditions for the plague's spread. Pope Clement VI, who witnessed the devastation firsthand, was forced to consecrate the Rhone River so that bodies could be thrown into it when the city's cemeteries overflowed. The papal court, with its vast wealth and sophisticated medical resources, proved no more capable of stopping the plague than the humblest village. Cardinals and clerks died alongside common pilgrims, their bodies added to the mass graves that ringed the city. As 1348 progressed, the plague continued its inexorable advance through France. It reached Paris, the kingdom's capital and largest city, in the summer of that year. Paris, with a population estimated at 200,000, was one of medieval Europe's great urban centres. Its university attracted scholars from across the continent, its markets supplied goods to much of northern France, and its craftsmen produced luxury items for the royal court and wealthy nobility. The plague's impact on Paris was devastating. The city's dense population and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for the disease's spread. The narrow streets and tall buildings of the medieval city centre trapped stagnant air and concentrated the population in spaces that facilitated transmission. The Seine River, which had long served as both a transportation route and a sewer, became clogged with bodies as the city's burial grounds overflowed. King Philip VI, who had initially dismissed reports of the plague as exaggerated, was forced to flee the capital as the death toll mounted. The royal court relocated to the countryside, leaving Paris to face the crisis largely on its own. The city's sophisticated administrative structure, developed over centuries of royal patronage, proved inadequate to the scale of the catastrophe. Tax collection ceased, courts closed, and essential services broke down, as officials either died or abandoned their posts. The University of Paris, one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious centres of learning, was particularly hard hit. Masters and students died in such numbers that many courses had to be suspended. The great libraries that had preserved classical learning through the medieval period stood empty as their custodians perished. The loss of human knowledge and expertise would be felt for generations as the accumulated wisdom of centuries vanished with those who possessed it. As winter approached in 1348, the plague's advance across France began to slow, though whether this was due to seasonal factors or simple exhaustion of susceptible populations remained unclear. What was certain was that the France that emerged from this first wave of plague was fundamentally different from the kingdom that had existed just months before. The population had been reduced by an estimated 1/3, entire regions had been depopulated, and the social and economic structures that had defined French society for centuries lay in ruins. But the plague was far from finished with Europe. As we shall see, its advance into England, the German states, and the far reaches of Scandinavia would bring new horrors and reveal the full extent of its power to reshape the medieval world. The darkest chapters of this story were yet to be written, and the full consequences of the Black Death would only become clear as the survivors struggled to make sense of the world they had inherited. By the spring of 1348, as the plague tightened its grip on France, merchant ships and trading vessels carried the pestilence across the English Channel to the shores of Britain. England, protected by the narrow stretch of water that had shielded it from so many continental conflicts, discovered that the sea provided no barrier against this microscopic invader. The first recorded outbreak occurred in the small port of Melcombe Regis, modern-day Weymouth, in Dorset, where a ship from Gascony brought more than wine and wool to English shores. The England of 1348 was a kingdom transformed by war and ambition. Edward III had been pursuing his claims to the French throne for over a decade, drawing England into the complex web of conflicts that would later be known as the 100 Years' War. The constant military campaigns had drained the royal treasury and created a network of troop movements and supply lines that would prove ideal pathways for plague transmission. English armies fighting in France would soon find themselves facing an enemy far more deadly than any human foe. From its initial foothold in Dorset, the plague spread along England's south coast with methodical efficiency. Bristol, one of the kingdom's most important ports and trading centres, fell to the disease within weeks. The city's bustling harbour, which connected England to Ireland, France and the wider Atlantic world, became a gateway for death rather than prosperity. Contemporary chronicles describe ships arriving in Bristol's harbour with their entire crews dead, drifting like ghost vessels until they ran aground on the muddy banks of the Avon River. The plague's advance through England revealed the interconnected nature of medieval society in ways that few had previously understood. The great roads built by the Romans centuries earlier and maintained by successive English kings became arteries of infection. Pilgrims travelling to Canterbury and other holy sites carried the disease from town to town. Their spiritual journeys transformed into missions of unwitting destruction. Market towns that had thrived for generations as centres of regional commerce found themselves at the epicentre of catastrophe as merchants and farmers gathered for weekly trading sessions. London, with its population approaching 80,000, represented the ultimate prize for the advancing pestilence. The city, in 1348, was a maze of narrow streets and overhanging buildings where sunlight rarely penetrated to the cobblestones below. The Thames, which brought wealth and trade to the capital, also brought the plague. Ships from infected continental ports docked at London Bridge, unloading their deadly cargo alongside legitimate trade goods. The impact on London was swift and devastating. The city's numerous religious houses, which had served as centres of learning and charity for centuries, were decimated. Westminster Abbey lost nearly half its monks within 6 months. The great Dominican and Franciscan friaries, whose members had dedicated their lives to serving the poor and sick, were particularly vulnerable, as their charitable work brought them into close contact with infected populations. Many orders were so depleted that they struggled to maintain basic religious services, leaving the spiritual needs of the population largely unmet. The royal court, based at Westminster, initially attempted to maintain normal operations despite the mounting crisis. King Edward III, preoccupied with his French campaigns, seemed reluctant to acknowledge the severity of the situation. However, as the death toll mounted and key officials began to perish, the machinery of government ground to a halt. Parliament, scheduled to meet in 1348, was prorogued indefinitely as members either died or refused to travel to the infected capital. The plague's impact on London's commercial life was equally severe. The city's guilds, which had regulated trade and craftsmanship for generations, found themselves unable to function as masters and apprentices died in equal numbers. The Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, responsible for maintaining the purity of England's currency, lost so many members that coin production virtually ceased. The wool trade, which had made England wealthy through exports to Flemish textile centres, collapsed as workers died and transportation networks broke down. Perhaps most disturbing to contemporary observers was the breakdown of law and order that accompanied the plague's advance. London's system of justice, based on royal courts and local magistrates, ceased to function as judges and clerks perished. Criminals roamed the streets with impunity, knowing that there were no authorities left to apprehend them. Wealthy merchants abandoned their homes, leaving them to be looted by desperate survivors. The city's elaborate system of waste disposal, never adequate at the best of times, completely collapsed, creating conditions that further accelerated the plague's spread. As winter approached in 1348, London resembled a city under siege, though the enemy was invisible and immune to any military response. Entire neighbourhoods stood empty, their inhabitants either dead or fled to the countryside. The Thames, which had once carried the ships of prosperous merchants, now bore a grim cargo of corpses thrown into the water when the city's burial grounds overflowed. The great bells of London's many churches, which had once marked the hours and called the faithful to prayer, fell silent as their ringers perished, and congregations disappeared. From London, the plague spread northward into the English heartland, following river valleys and ancient roads toward York and the Scottish border. The kingdom's elaborate feudal structure, built on personal bonds between lords and vassals, began to crumble as death severed these relationships. Manor houses that had dominated their local landscapes for centuries stood empty as their owners perished without heirs. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for generations returned to wilderness as their tillers died and no one remained to work the soil. The plague's arrival in rural England revealed the profound interconnectedness of medieval agricultural society. The great estates that had fed England's growing population depended on complex relationships between landlords, tenant farmers, and agricultural labourers. When key individuals in this network died, the entire system could collapse. Harvests rotted in the fields as there were no hands to gather them. Livestock wandered freely as their shepherds perished, many animals eventually dying of starvation or falling prey to wolves that grew bold in the absence of human presence. Village communities that had existed since Saxon times simply vanished from the map. Entire settlements were abandoned as their populations either died or fled, leaving behind only empty houses and overgrown gardens. Churches that had served these communities for centuries stood open to the elements, their congregations extinct and their priests either dead or reassigned to serve the desperate needs of surviving populations elsewhere. The psychological impact of such complete social collapse was perhaps as devastating as the physical toll of the disease itself. Survivors found themselves in a world where all the certainties that had governed their lives had disappeared. The feudal bonds that had defined social relationships for centuries meant nothing when there were no lords left to serve or vassals to command. The religious framework that had provided meaning and comfort to generations of believers seemed to offer no protection against the advancing pestilence. As 1349 dawned, the plague continued its relentless advance through northern England and into Scotland. The Scottish kingdom, which had long resisted English attempts at conquest, found itself defenceless against this microscopic invader. Edinburgh and Glasgow experienced devastation comparable to that which had befallen London and Paris. The Scottish Highlands, with their scattered populations and difficult terrain, offered no refuge as the plague followed trade routes and clan networks into the most remote glens and islands. The impact on Ireland was equally severe. The Anglo-Norman colonists who had established themselves in the eastern regions of the island were particularly vulnerable, as their urban centres and commercial networks provided ideal conditions for plague transmission. Dublin, the seat of English administration in Ireland, lost perhaps half its population within a single year. The native Irish population living in more dispersed rural settlements initially suffered less severely, but they too would eventually fall victim to the advancing pestilence. Across the Irish Sea, Wales experienced its own catastrophe as the plague swept through the Principality's valleys and coastal regions. The Welsh, who had only recently been brought under English rule following Edward the Shit's conquests, found their traditional social structures as vulnerable to plague as their Norman neighbours. The bardic tradition, which had preserved Welsh culture and history for centuries, was nearly extinguished as the poets and storytellers who maintained these oral traditions perished without passing on their knowledge. Meanwhile, on the European continent, the plague continued its methodical conquest of the German states and the Low Countries. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened by conflicts between competing claimants to the imperial throne, proved incapable of mounting any coordinated response to the crisis. Each principality, duchy, and free city was left to face the plague alone, with predictably devastating results. Cologne, one of the empire's greatest cities and a major centre of trade along the Rhine, experienced mortality rates that rivaled those seen in Paris and London. The city's magnificent cathedral, still under construction after decades of work, stood as a monument to vanished ambitions as the craftsmen and architects who had devoted their lives to its completion perished. Work on the great building would not resume for centuries, leaving it as a permanent reminder of the plague's devastating impact on medieval civilization. The Low Countries, with their dense urban populations and extensive trade networks, proved particularly vulnerable to the plague's advance. Bruges, the commercial heart of northern Europe, and a city whose wealth rivaled that of Venice or Florence, saw its prosperity evaporate as merchants died and trade routes collapsed. The city's great market square, where goods from across the known world had once changed hands, stood empty as grass grew between the cobblestones. Brussels, Ghent, and other Flemish cities experienced similar devastation. The region's textile industry, which had clothed much of medieval Europe, ground to a halt as weavers and cloth merchants perished. The elaborate guild system that had regulated production and maintained quality standards for generations simply ceased to function, as too few masters survived to train new apprentices or oversee production. As the plague advanced into the German heartland, it encountered a political landscape already fractured by conflict and competition. The absence of strong central authority meant that each locality faced the crisis in isolation, with no coordination of resources or sharing of knowledge about potential treatments or preventive measures. Cities that had competed commercially for centuries found themselves united only in their suffering, as the plague demonstrated its complete indifference to human politics and rivalries. The plague's advance through Central Europe also brought it into contact with populations that had previously been isolated from the disease. The Kingdom of Poland, under the rule of Casimir the Third, initially seemed to offer some resistance to the plague's advance. Whether this was due to the kingdom's relative isolation, different urban planning, or simple chance remained unclear to contemporary observers. However, this apparent immunity proved temporary, and Poland would eventually experience its own devastating outbreaks. Hungary, positioned at the crossroads between Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire, found itself particularly vulnerable as the plague advanced from multiple directions simultaneously. The kingdom's strategic location, which had brought it wealth and political importance, now made it a focal point for the converging streams of infection spreading westward from Constantinople and southward from Poland and Bohemia. As 1349 progressed, the plague's advance into Scandinavia marked yet another phase in its conquest of Europe. Norway, with its extensive maritime connections, was among the first Nordic countries to experience the full impact of the disease. Bergen, the kingdom's most important commercial centre and the headquarters of the Hanseatic League's northern operations, was devastated as ships from infected German ports brought the plague to Norwegian shores. The plague spread through Norway's fjords, and coastal settlements followed the sea routes that had connected these communities for generations. Fishing villages that had survived Viking raids and harsh winters for centuries were abandoned as their populations perished. The great stave churches that dotted the Norwegian landscape stood empty, their distinctive wooden architecture echoing with the absence of congregations that would never return. Sweden and Denmark experienced similar devastation as the plague crossed the narrow straits that separated them from the infected German territories. Stockholm, still a relatively young city, but already emerging as an important centre of Swedish power, lost perhaps half its population. The Hanseatic merchants who had brought prosperity to the Baltic region now brought death. Their trading networks transformed into pathways of destruction. The plague's advance into the far reaches of Scandinavia marked the geographic limits of its European conquest. Beyond the Arctic Circle, scattered populations of Sami herders and Norse settlers experienced their own encounters with the disease, though the extreme isolation of these communities meant that many escaped the worst effects of the pandemic. The plague had effectively reached the edge of the medieval world, having conquered virtually every major population centre between the Atlantic Ocean and the Ural Mountains. By the end of 1349, the Black Death had transformed the map of Europe in ways that would have been unimaginable just 3 years earlier. Entire regions had been depopulated, great cities reduced to shadows of their former selves, and the complex web of relationships that had defined medieval society lay in tatters. Yet even as contemporaries struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the catastrophe that had befallen them, new chapters in this story of transformation were already beginning to unfold. The plague had not merely killed people, it had killed an entire way of life. The feudal system that had organized European society for centuries was collapsing as the bonds between lords and vassals dissolved in the face of universal mortality. The Catholic Church, which had provided spiritual guidance and temporal authority for generations, found its credibility shattered as prayers proved powerless against the advancing pestilence. The economic networks that had sustained medieval civilization lay broken, their key nodes depopulated and their trade routes abandoned. Yet from this devastation, something new was beginning to emerge. The survivors of the Black Death would inherit a world transformed, one in which traditional authorities had lost their power and new opportunities beckoned for those bold enough to seize them. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval life were giving way to more fluid arrangements as labour became scarce and valuable. The intellectual certainties that had sustained medieval thought were being questioned as scholars struggled to understand how such devastation could occur in a world supposedly governed by divine providence. As we shall see, the Black Death was not merely an ending, but also a beginning. The world that emerged from the plague would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before, marked by new forms of art and literature, new economic relationships, and new ways of understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. The medieval world was dying, but from its death throes, the Renaissance was already beginning to stir. As the plague's grip on Europe tightened through 1349 and into 1350, the very foundations of medieval society began to crack and crumble like ancient mortar exposed to winter frost. The rigid hierarchies that had seemed as permanent as cathedral stones revealed themselves to be as fragile as morning mist. In manor houses across the continent, lords discovered that their authority meant nothing when there were no serfs left to command. In bustling market towns, guild masters found themselves without apprentices to train or journeymen to supervise. The elaborate social machinery that had sustained European civilization for centuries ground to a halt, its human components scattered to the winds or buried in hastily dug graves. The economic transformation was perhaps even more dramatic than the social upheaval. For generations, Europe had operated under a system where land was everything and labour was abundant. Peasants bound to the soil by feudal obligations had worked their lords' estates for meagre compensation, their lives circumscribed by traditions stretching back to Charlemagne's time. But the plague changed all of this with ruthless efficiency. Suddenly, land was plentiful and labourers were scarce. The basic mathematics of medieval economics had been turned upside down. In the English countryside, survivors found themselves in a position their grandparents could never have imagined. Villages that had once teemed with families now echoed with emptiness, their fields lying fallow for want of hands to work them. The surviving peasants, once grateful for any opportunity to earn their daily bread, could now demand wages that would have seemed fantastical just years before. Lords who had once commanded absolute obedience from their tenants were forced to negotiate, to offer incentives, to compete for labour as desperately as merchants competed for rare spices from distant lands. The transformation was not limited to the countryside. In London's surviving workshops, master craftsmen who had once enjoyed a steady supply of eager apprentices found themselves begging young men to learn their trades. The ancient guilds, with their elaborate hierarchies and jealously guarded secrets, were forced to abandon centuries-old restrictions as they struggled simply to maintain their membership. Blacksmiths, carpenters, masons and weavers all faced the same crisis: too much work and too few hands to do it. This labour shortage created opportunities that would have been unthinkable in the rigid social structure of pre-plague Europe. Peasants abandoned their ancestral villages to seek better wages in distant towns. Serfs fled their masters' estates under cover of darkness, knowing that other lords would welcome them with open arms and ask no questions about their origins. Women, previously confined to domestic roles, found themselves managing businesses and estates as their husbands, fathers, and brothers perished. The social mobility that had been virtually impossible in the medieval world suddenly became not just possible, but necessary for society's very survival. The authorities, both secular and religious, watched these developments with growing alarm. The careful balance of obligations and privileges that had maintained social order for centuries was dissolving before their eyes. In England, King Edward III and his nobles attempted to stem the tide of change through legislation. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from leaving their traditional occupations or locations. Similar laws were passed throughout Europe as frightened elites attempted to preserve their privileges through legal force. But the new economic reality proved stronger than any royal decree. Employers who obeyed the wage restrictions found themselves without workers, while those who ignored the law could fill their workshops and harvest their fields. The black market in labour flourished as desperate lords offered under-the-table bonuses and privileges to attract the workers they needed. Enforcement proved nearly impossible, as local officials, often facing their own labour shortages, turned a blind eye to violations that kept their communities functioning. The Church, which had been the great unifying force of medieval Europe, found itself facing a crisis that threatened its very foundations. For centuries, the Catholic hierarchy had taught that suffering was part of God's plan, that earthly tribulations were tests of faith that would be rewarded in the afterlife. But the scale and randomness of plague mortality challenged these comfortable certainties. Why had so many priests and monks perished while caring for the sick, when the very purpose of their vocation was to serve God? Why had entire monasteries been wiped out while some notorious sinners survived unscathed? The clergy who survived the initial waves of plague found themselves overwhelmed by the spiritual needs of traumatized populations, while simultaneously dealing with their own institutional collapse. Monasteries that had preserved learning and culture for centuries stood empty or were reduced to a handful of elderly monks. Cathedral schools that had trained generations of clerks and administrators could no longer function. The elaborate network of religious institutions that had provided social services, education, and spiritual guidance lay in ruins. Perhaps most troubling for church authorities was the emergence of new forms of religious expression that challenged traditional orthodoxy. Across Europe, groups of laypeople began taking religious observance into their own hands, forming movements that emphasized direct personal relationship with God rather than mediation through clerical hierarchy. These groups, often led by charismatic preachers who claimed special divine revelation, attracted followers who had lost faith in the institutional church's ability to provide protection or explanation for the catastrophe they had witnessed. The most dramatic of these movements was the Brotherhood of Flagellants, bands of penitents who travelled from town to town, stripping to the waist and scourging themselves with leather whips embedded with iron spikes. They believed that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, and that only through extreme physical penance could God's wrath be appeased. Their processions drew enormous crowds of desperate people seeking any explanation for the inexplicable horror they had endured. The flagellants' rituals were both terrifying and mesmerizing. They would enter a town singing hymns in their native tongues rather than Latin, immediately marking themselves as different from traditional clergy. In the town square, they would form a circle and begin their ritual scourging, blood streaming down their backs as they called upon God for mercy. Their leaders claimed the power to grant absolution without priestly intervention, directly challenging the Church's monopoly on salvation. For a time, these penitential processions seemed to offer what official religion could not, a sense of agency in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. If the plague was indeed divine punishment, then perhaps human action could influence divine mercy. The flagellants' message resonated with populations that had watched helplessly as traditional religious remedies proved powerless against the advancing pestilence. However, the movement soon revealed darker impulses. As the flagellant bands moved from town to town, they increasingly turned their attention to scapegoats, who could be blamed for divine displeasure. Jewish communities, already marginalized and vulnerable, became particular targets. The flagellants preached that God's anger could only be appeased by eliminating those who had rejected Christ, transforming religious penance into genocidal violence. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death represents one of the darkest chapters in an already horrific period. Across Europe, Jewish communities that had survived centuries of periodic harassment and discrimination found themselves facing systematic extermination. The accusations were as absurd as they were deadly. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, of practicing ritual murder, of conspiring with the devil to bring about Christian destruction. The reality was far different and more complex. Jewish communities often had better survival rates during plague outbreaks, not because of any supernatural protection or diabolical alliance, but because of practical factors related to their religious practices and social position. Jewish law required frequent hand-washing and personal hygiene that was uncommon in medieval Christian society. Their dietary restrictions meant they often ate fresher food and avoided potentially contaminated sources. Their marginalized social position meant they had less contact with infected populations in the early stages of outbreaks. But rather than being recognized as evidence of better health practices, Jewish survival became proof of guilt in the minds of traumatized Christian populations seeking someone to blame for their suffering. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive on Valentine's Day 1349, before the plague had even reached the city. In Mainz, the entire Jewish quarter was destroyed, as Christians turned their grief and terror into homicidal rage. Similar massacres occurred in hundreds of communities across the continent. The Pope, Clement VI, attempted to protect Jewish populations by issuing papal bulls pointing out the obvious fact that Jews were dying of plague in the same proportions as Christians, and that the disease was spreading in regions where no Jews lived. But papal authority carried little weight with mobs seeking vengeance for inexplicable loss. Local authorities, when they survived, often looked the other way as Jewish property was seized and redistributed among Christian neighbours. The economic motives behind anti-Jewish violence were often as important as religious ones. Jewish communities had traditionally filled economic niches forbidden to Christians, particularly money lending and international trade. The plague provided a convenient excuse for Christian debtors to eliminate their creditors and competitors to seize lucrative business opportunities. The combination of religious hysteria and economic opportunism proved lethal for Jewish communities across Europe. The cultural impact of the Black Death extended far beyond economics and politics into the realm of art, literature, and philosophy. The medieval worldview, which had emphasized the temporary nature of earthly existence while focusing on eternal salvation, took on new and darker meanings when confronted with such massive mortality. Artists and writers began exploring themes of death and decay with unprecedented intensity and realism. The motif of the dance of death, or danse macabre, emerged as one of the most powerful artistic responses to the plague experience. These artistic works depicted death as a skeleton leading representatives of all social classes in a final dance, emphasizing that mortality was the one truly universal human experience. Kings and peasants, bishops and merchants all danced together toward the grave, their earthly distinctions meaningless in the face of ultimate equality. This democratic vision of death represented a radical departure from earlier medieval art, which had typically emphasized social hierarchy and divine order. The dance of death paintings that appeared on church walls and in illuminated manuscripts showed death claiming victims randomly rather than according to merit or social position. The message was clear: neither wealth nor piety, neither noble birth nor scholarly learning could provide protection against the common fate that awaited all humanity. Literature of the post-plague period similarly reflected the transformed worldview of survivors. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the plague's devastation of Florence, presented a world where traditional moral authorities had collapsed and individuals were forced to create their own ethical frameworks. The frame narrative of 10 young people fleeing plague-ravaged Florence to tell stories in the countryside became a metaphor for humanity's need to create meaning and beauty in the face of inexplicable suffering. The stories told by Boccaccio's characters often featured clever individuals triumphing through wit and adaptability rather than through adherence to traditional virtues. Priests appeared as lustful hypocrites, nobles as bumbling fools, and merchants as heroes of ingenuity and enterprise. This inversion of traditional values reflected the social upheaval that the plague had brought to Italian society, where established hierarchies had lost their credibility along with their power. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written several decades after the plague, but clearly influenced by its social transformations, similarly presented a world where traditional authorities were subjects of satire rather than reverence. The pilgrims travelling to Canterbury represented a cross-section of English society, but their tales often mocked the very institutions and values they supposedly embodied. The corrupt pardoner selling fake relics, the hypocritical friar seducing women while preaching celibacy, and the greedy physician prolonging illnesses for profit, all reflected a society that had lost faith in its traditional leaders. The visual arts underwent equally dramatic transformation. Pre-plague art had typically emphasized the divine and eternal, with human figures serving primarily as vehicles for spiritual messages. Post-plague art showed increasing interest in individual psychology and realistic human emotion. Faces in paintings began to show genuine suffering, fear, and grief rather than the stylized expressions of earlier periods. Architecture, too, reflected changing attitudes toward death and spirituality. Churches built after the plague often featured elaborate tombs and memorial chapels that emphasized individual identity rather than collective salvation. The transy tomb, showing the deceased both as they appeared in life and as decaying corpses, became popular among wealthy patrons who wanted to memorialize both their earthly achievements and their ultimate fate. The plague's impact on intellectual life was equally profound. The medieval synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology, which had dominated European thought for centuries, came under increasing scrutiny from scholars who had witnessed the apparent randomness of plague mortality. If God truly governed the world according to rational principles, how could such massive and indiscriminate suffering be explained? New philosophical schools emerged that emphasized empirical observation over theoretical speculation. The nominalist philosophy of William of Ockham, which questioned whether universal concepts had any reality beyond human mental constructs, gained adherents among scholars who had seen how quickly, supposedly, eternal institutions could vanish. The scientific method, which would later transform European understanding of the natural world, had its roots in this post-plague skepticism about inherited authorities and received wisdom. Medical knowledge, such as it was, also underwent transformation. The complete failure of traditional treatments had discredited much of ancient medical theory, opening space for new approaches based on observation rather than textual authority. While effective treatments for plague would not emerge for centuries, the crisis had begun the process of questioning inherited medical wisdom that would eventually lead to genuine scientific progress. Universities that survived the plague often found themselves with reduced enrollments and faculties, but those that continued to function began emphasizing practical knowledge alongside traditional scholastic subjects. Legal studies became more important as survivors struggled to sort out inheritance issues and property disputes in the aftermath of mass mortality. Mathematical and accounting skills gained value as the new economic relationships required more sophisticated record keeping and financial management. The transformation of European society during and after the Black Death was not uniform across regions or social classes. Some areas recovered more quickly than others, and some groups adapted more successfully to the new conditions. Italian city-states, with their commercial traditions and urban focus, often proved more resilient than rural areas dependent on traditional agricultural relationships. Regions with strong central authority sometimes managed the crisis more effectively than those with fragmented political structures. The pace of change also varied considerably. Some transformations, like the immediate labour shortage and wage increases, appeared almost overnight. Others, like the development of new artistic styles or philosophical approaches, emerged gradually over decades. The full consequences of the plague would not become apparent until centuries later, as the economic and social changes it had initiated worked their way through European society. But even as contemporaries struggled to understand and adapt to their transformed world, the plague itself was beginning to evolve and change. The massive mortality of the initial outbreaks had eliminated much of the susceptible population, creating new patterns of transmission and resistance. The bacterium that caused the disease faced its own evolutionary pressures, adapting to new host populations and environmental conditions. Regional outbreaks would continue to occur throughout the late medieval and early modern periods, but they would never again achieve the devastating scale of the original pandemic. European populations developed some degree of resistance through both genetic selection and acquired immunity. Urban planning improved gradually as authorities learned to manage waste disposal and water supplies more effectively. Medical knowledge, while still primitive by modern standards, slowly accumulated practical experience about quarantine and isolation procedures. The Black Death's grip on Europe was finally beginning to loosen, but the world it left behind bore little resemblance to the one it had found. The medieval order was dying, and from its decay something entirely new was struggling to be born. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on individual achievement and empirical investigation, was already stirring in the Italian city-states. The Protestant Reformation, which would shatter the unity of Western Christianity, was still more than a century away, but had its intellectual roots in the post-plague questioning of traditional authority. The rise of national monarchies, the development of capitalism, the age of exploration, and the scientific revolution all had their origins in the transformed world that emerged from the plague years. The Black Death had not merely killed millions of people, it had killed the medieval world itself, clearing the ground for the emergence of the modern era. As survivors picked through the ruins of their civilization, they could not have imagined the world their descendants would build from the fragments. But already, in the changed relationships between masters and servants, in the new questioning of old authorities, in the fresh attention to individual experience and empirical observation, the seeds of that future world were beginning to germinate in soil fertilized by the greatest catastrophe in human history. As the immediate crisis of mass mortality began to subside in the early 1350s, survivors found themselves inhabiting a landscape both familiar and utterly alien. The physical geography remained unchanged. The same rivers flowed toward the same seas, the same mountains rose toward the same skies, but the human geography had been redrawn by forces beyond comprehension. Villages that had bustled with life for centuries stood silent as tombs, their streets grass-grown, and their houses slowly surrendering to ivy and weather. Yet in other places, new communities sprang up almost overnight as refugees gathered around crossroads or river fords, creating settlements that owed nothing to tradition and everything to the pragmatic needs of survival. The survivors themselves were changed in ways that went far deeper than mere numbers. They had witnessed the collapse of every certainty that had structured their ancestors' lives, and this experience marked them with a psychological transformation as profound as any physical scar. These were people who had seen parents abandon children, and children flee from parents, who had watched priests desert their flocks, and lords abandon their vassals. They had lived through the dissolution of bonds that medieval society had considered sacred and eternal, and this knowledge fundamentally altered their relationship with authority, tradition, and even hope itself. In the English countryside, this transformation manifested in ways both subtle and dramatic. Manor courts that had once been venues for maintaining traditional relationships between lords and tenants became scenes of hard-nosed negotiation, where ancient customs carried little weight against the brutal arithmetic of supply and demand. Peasants who had once approached their social superiors with caps in hand and eyes downcast now met them as equals, knowing that their labour was more valuable than any title or bloodline. The language itself began to change, reflecting these new realities. Terms that had carried specific meanings within the feudal hierarchy became fluid and negotiable. The word service no longer implied automatic submission, but rather a contractual relationship that could be terminated if terms proved unsatisfactory. Loyalty became something to be earned rather than demanded. Honour increasingly meant keeping one's word in business dealings rather than maintaining one's position in an elaborate social dance. French villages experienced similar transformations, though often with different regional variations that reflected local conditions and customs. In Normandy, where the plague's impact had been particularly severe, entire systems of agricultural management had to be improvised from nothing. Survivors found themselves managing estates they had never expected to inherit, making decisions about crop rotation and livestock breeding with no guidance beyond practical necessity. The elaborate agricultural treaties that had guided medieval farming for generations gathered dust in abandoned libraries, while unlettered peasants developed new techniques through trial and error. And the Champagne region, which had been the commercial heart of medieval France, faced the peculiar challenge of maintaining its famous trade fairs when both merchants and customers had largely disappeared. The great markets of Troyes and Provence, which had once attracted traders from across Europe, stood nearly empty as grass grew between the cobblestones, where fortunes had once been made and lost. Yet gradually, new forms of commerce began to emerge, adapted to the changed circumstances of a depopulated world. These new commercial relationships reflected the broader social changes that the plague had accelerated. Credit systems became more sophisticated as merchants learned to operate across greater distances with smaller volumes of goods. Insurance arrangements, previously limited to maritime ventures, expanded to cover overland trade as the risks of conducting business in a depopulated landscape became apparent. Banking houses that had survived the initial crisis by maintaining liquidity during the chaos found themselves in positions of unprecedented influence as traditional sources of capital disappeared. The Italian peninsula, with its sophisticated urban culture and commercial traditions, adapted to the post-plague world with characteristic innovation and pragmatism. In Florence, the demographic catastrophe had eliminated many of the established merchant families that had dominated the city's economic life for generations. The survivors found themselves with opportunities for advancement that would have been unthinkable in the rigid social hierarchies of the pre-plague world. Artisans became merchants, merchants became bankers, and bankers found themselves wielding political influence that rivaled that of the old nobility. The Medici family's rise to prominence exemplified these new possibilities. Originally modest money changers, they used the opportunities created by demographic chaos to establish banking relationships across Europe, eventually becoming the de facto rulers of Florence and patrons of the Renaissance. Their success story was repeated, on smaller scales, throughout Italy, as survivors learned to navigate a world where traditional authorities had lost their power and new forms of wealth and influence were constantly emerging. Venice, with its unique position as a bridge between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, faced particular challenges as the plague disrupted the trade networks that were the foundation of its prosperity. The city's merchants, forced to find new routes and new partners, began exploring commercial possibilities that had previously been considered too risky or unprofitable. These innovations would eventually contribute to the age of exploration, as Venetian capital and expertise helped finance the voyages that would reshape the global economy. The Holy Roman Empire, already politically fragmented before the plague, found its internal divisions deepened by the demographic catastrophe. Princes and bishops, who had once commanded substantial resources through feudal obligations, discovered that their theoretical authority meant little when there were no subjects left to command. The empire's elaborate constitutional structure, based on complex relationships between emperor, electors, and lesser nobles, began to break down as key positions went unfilled and traditional ceremonies became impossible to maintain. In the German cities, however, a different pattern emerged. Urban centres that had maintained their populations through the crisis found themselves in stronger positions relative to the surrounding countryside than they had ever enjoyed before. Cities like Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Frankfurt began asserting greater independence from their nominal feudal overlords, developing new forms of republican government that reflected the changed balance of power between urban and rural interests. The Hanseatic League, the commercial confederation that dominated trade in Northern Europe, had to reinvent itself as many of its member cities struggled with reduced populations and disrupted trade routes. The League's traditional assembly, the Hanstag, found itself making decisions for communities that no longer existed or had been reduced to mere villages. Yet the organization's flexible structure and commercial focus allowed it to adapt more successfully than many purely feudal institutions. Poland presented a unique case study in plague resistance and recovery. Under King Casimir III, the kingdom had maintained more centralized authority than many of its neighbors, and this political cohesion proved valuable in coordinating responses to the demographic crisis. The kingdom's agricultural economy, less dependent on complex feudal relationships than Western European systems, proved more resilient in the face of population loss. Polish recovery was further aided by immigration from heavily affected regions to the west, as survivors sought opportunities in areas that had suffered less severe depopulation. The Scandinavian kingdoms faced their own particular challenges as the plague disrupted the maritime networks that connected their scattered populations. Norway's extensive coastline and fjord system had previously been assets that facilitated trade and communication, but these same features became liabilities when plague-infected ships could appear in any harbour without warning. Coastal communities that had thrived for centuries were abandoned as survivors retreated inland, fundamentally altering the human geography of the region. Sweden and Denmark experienced similar disruptions to their traditional patterns of settlement and economic activity. The Danish monarchy, which had been building a more centralized state apparatus, found its efforts complicated by the need to govern territories where administrative records had been lost and local officials had perished. The Swedish kingdom faced the additional challenge of maintaining control over its Finnish territories, where plague mortality had been particularly severe among the Swedish-speaking administrative class. Hungary and Bohemia, positioned at the intersection of various trade routes and migration patterns, experienced the plague as a series of overlapping waves rather than a single, catastrophic event. This pattern of repeated exposure created different social dynamics than those seen in regions that experienced one massive outbreak, followed by gradual recovery. Communities that had begun to rebuild after the first wave found themselves devastated again by subsequent outbreaks, creating a cycle of destruction and recovery that prevented the establishment of stable new social arrangements. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by centuries of territorial losses and internal conflicts, found the plague to be a final blow to its remaining strength. Constantinople, which had once been the largest city in Europe, was reduced to a fraction of its former size. The empire's complex administrative system, inherited from ancient Rome and refined over centuries, simply collapsed as there were no longer enough educated officials to maintain its operations. The emperor found himself ruling over territories that were largely depopulated and cities that were shadows of their former greatness. Throughout Eastern Europe, the plague's impact was complicated by ongoing conflicts with expanding Ottoman forces and various nomadic groups from the steppes. Communities that might have recovered from plague losses found themselves facing military threats that made recovery impossible. The combination of disease and warfare created a cycle of devastation that would characterize the region for generations to come. The religious landscape of post-plague Europe was equally transformed, though the changes often took decades to become fully apparent. The Catholic Church, having lost perhaps half its clergy during the crisis, faced a shortage of trained priests that forced fundamental changes in religious practice. Parishes that had once enjoyed elaborate liturgical ceremonies found themselves served by barely literate clergy who struggled to perform even basic sacraments. Monasteries that had preserved learning and culture for centuries stood empty or were reduced to a handful of elderly monks who could no longer maintain their institution's scholarly traditions. The shortage of clergy created opportunities for lay religious movements that had previously been suppressed or marginalized. In many regions, devout lay people began taking responsibility for religious education and spiritual guidance that had previously been the exclusive domain of ordained priests. These developments challenged traditional ecclesiastical hierarchy and created precedents for the Protestant emphasis on individual religious authority that would emerge in the following centuries. New forms of popular piety emerged that reflected the traumatic experiences of plague survivors. Devotion to saints associated with plague protection, such as Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian, became widespread. Pilgrimage sites dedicated to these saints attracted crowds of survivors seeking both spiritual comfort and tangible protection against future outbreaks. The popularity of these devotions reflected a more transactional approach to religion, where divine favour was sought through specific practices rather than general moral improvement. The cult of the Virgin Mary also evolved in response to plague experiences. Mary's role as intercessor between humanity and divine justice took on new significance for people who had witnessed the apparent randomness of plague mortality. Artistic depictions of the Virgin increasingly emphasized her maternal compassion and her power to protect the faithful from earthly dangers as well as spiritual threats. Educational institutions throughout Europe faced the challenge of rebuilding from virtually nothing. Universities that had once attracted students from across the continent found themselves with reduced faculties and empty lecture halls. The University of Paris, which had been the intellectual centre of medieval Europe, struggled to maintain even basic instruction, as many of its masters had perished and its student body had largely dispersed. The curriculum itself began to change in response to new social needs. Legal studies became more important as survivors struggled to sort out inheritance issues and property disputes in the absence of clear records or living witnesses. Medical training, though still primitive by modern standards, gained new respect as communities recognized the need for any knowledge that might help them cope with future epidemics. Practical subjects like accounting and business management found their way into university curricula as the new economic relationships required more sophisticated record keeping, and financial planning. The intellectual climate of post-plague Europe was characterized by a new skepticism toward inherited authorities and traditional explanations. Scholars who had witnessed the complete failure of established medical and theological responses to the plague began questioning other received wisdom. This critical attitude would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation, but its immediate impact was to create an atmosphere of intellectual uncertainty and experimentation. New approaches to understanding the natural world began to emerge from this intellectual ferment. The careful observation of plague symptoms and transmission patterns, though it did not lead to immediate medical breakthroughs, established habits of empirical investigation that would prove valuable in other fields. Astronomers and mathematicians, freed from some traditional constraints by the collapse of established institutions, began developing new theoretical frameworks that would eventually revolutionize European understanding of the cosmos. The artistic and cultural life of post-plague Europe reflected these broader intellectual and social changes. Patronage patterns shifted as traditional noble families disappeared and new sources of wealth emerged. Successful merchants and bankers, eager to establish their social credentials, became important supporters of artists and scholars. This new patronage often emphasized different values than traditional aristocratic support, favoring works that demonstrated commercial success and individual achievement rather than noble lineage and feudal loyalty. The themes explored by artists and writers increasingly reflected the experiences and concerns of plague survivors. Death became a central preoccupation, but not in the abstract theological sense that had characterized earlier medieval art. Instead, artists began exploring the physical and emotional reality of mortality with unprecedented directness and psychological insight. The Iris Moriendi, or art of dying well, became a popular literary genre that offered practical guidance for facing death rather than abstract theological speculation. The emergence of vernacular literature accelerated as Latin literacy declined among the reduced population of educated elites. Writers began composing works in their native languages, not only to reach broader audiences, but also because the classical Latin educational system had largely collapsed. This linguistic shift had profound cultural implications, as it allowed for the development of national literatures that reflected local experiences and values rather than universal Latin culture. Music and performance also adapted to the changed social landscape. The elaborate polyphonic compositions that had characterized cathedral music became impossible to maintain when choir schools could no longer train sufficient singers. Simpler musical forms emerged that could be performed by smaller groups with less training. Popular music began to play a larger role in religious and secular celebrations as communities sought forms of cultural expression that did not require extensive institutional support. The physical rebuilding of Europe proceeded slowly and unevenly, reflecting both the reduced population and the changed social relationships that governed construction projects. Churches that had been damaged during the plague years often remained in ruins for decades as communities lacked both the resources and the population to support major reconstruction efforts. When building did resume, it often reflected new architectural priorities that emphasized functionality over grandeur. Urban planning began to incorporate lessons learned from the plague experience. Cities that rebuilt their damaged districts sometimes included wider streets and better drainage systems, though the understanding of disease transmission remained primitive. Market squares were often relocated to reduce crowding, and public buildings were designed with better ventilation. These changes, while not based on accurate medical knowledge, sometimes had beneficial effects on public health. Rural settlement patterns also changed as survivors abandoned marginal agricultural lands and concentrated in areas with better soil and water access. Villages that had persisted for centuries in difficult locations were permanently abandoned as their populations either died or relocated to more promising sites. This consolidation of settlement created new patterns of land use that would characterize European agriculture for centuries to come. The legal systems of post-plague Europe had to adapt to circumstances that had never been anticipated by traditional jurisprudence. Courts found themselves dealing with inheritance disputes where entire family lines had been extinguished, leaving no clear heirs or even reliable witnesses to property ownership. Marriage laws had to be modified to address situations where spouses had disappeared without clear evidence of death. Contract law evolved to handle cases where parties to agreements had vanished, leaving obligations unfulfilled and damages uncompensated. These legal adaptations often reflected broader social changes in the relationships between individuals and communities. Traditional collective responsibilities gave way to more individualized legal frameworks, as communities lacked the social cohesion to enforce customary obligations. Property rights became more absolute as traditional communal controls weakened. Personal freedom of movement and occupation increased as feudal restrictions became unenforceable. The emergence of new legal principles during this period would have lasting effects on European jurisprudence. The concept of individual rights, which would later become central to liberal political theory, had some of its origins in the legal improvisations necessitated by post-plague social conditions. The idea that individuals could negotiate their own terms of employment and residence rather than being bound by inherited status gained legal recognition out of practical necessity before it became a theoretical principle. As the 1350s drew to a close, Europe was beginning to stabilize in its new configuration, though recovery remained incomplete and uneven. The demographic catastrophe had created opportunities for social mobility that would have been impossible under the old system, but it had also destroyed much of the accumulated wealth and cultural achievement of medieval civilization. The survivors found themselves inheritors of a world that was simultaneously full of possibilities and bereft of familiar guideposts. The children born into this transformed world would grow up with fundamentally different expectations and assumptions than their grandparents had possessed. They would take for granted levels of social mobility and individual autonomy that earlier generations had never imagined possible. They would inherit a cultural landscape marked by skepticism toward traditional authority and openness to innovation and change. These attitudes would shape European development for centuries to come, contributing to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and eventually the Enlightenment. The Black Death had not merely killed millions of people, it had killed an entire world and given birth to another. The medieval synthesis of feudalism, scholasticism, and Catholic unity lay in ruins, but from those ruins emerged the foundations of modernity itself. As survivors continued the difficult work of rebuilding their shattered civilization, they could not have known that they were creating the world we recognize as the beginning of our own historical era. The transformation of European society in the decades following the Black Death's initial devastation extended far beyond the immediate crisis of mortality and economic disruption. As communities struggled to rebuild their shattered world, they discovered that the very foundations of human knowledge and understanding had been called into question. The plague had not merely challenged political and social structures, it had shaken the intellectual edifice upon which medieval civilization rested, forcing survivors to confront fundamental questions about the nature of existence itself. In monastery scriptoriums across Europe, where generations of monks had carefully preserved and copied the texts of classical antiquity and Christian theology, empty desks bore silent witness to the knowledge that had died with their scribes. Libraries that had taken centuries to assemble gathered dust as there were no longer enough literate clerics to maintain them. The great chain of learning that had connected medieval scholars to their ancient predecessors had been broken, creating an intellectual void that would take generations to fill. Yet from this educational catastrophe emerged unexpected opportunities for innovation and discovery. Young scholars who might once have spent decades studying traditional authorities now found themselves forced to rely on direct observation and practical experimentation. The collapse of established curricula created space for new approaches to understanding the natural world, approaches that emphasized evidence over authority and practical results over theoretical elegance. Medical practice, though still primitive by any modern standard, began to evolve in response to the complete failure of traditional treatments during the plague years. Physicians who had survived the pandemic often abandoned the elaborate theoretical systems that had dominated medieval medicine in favor of simpler, more pragmatic approaches based on careful observation of symptoms and outcomes. While they still lacked understanding of disease mechanisms, their willingness to question inherited wisdom marked the beginning of a more empirical approach to healing. The study of anatomy, previously limited to theoretical discussions based on ancient texts, began to incorporate actual dissection and observation. Universities that had once forbidden the examination of human corpses now permitted such studies out of desperate necessity to understand the plague's effects. These anatomical investigations, while initially focused on plague-related pathology, gradually expanded to encompass broader questions about human physiology and disease processes. Mathematical knowledge also evolved as the economic transformations of the post-plague world created new practical demands. Merchants operating in the changed commercial landscape needed more sophisticated methods for calculating profits, managing credit, and assessing risks across uncertain trade routes. The mathematical techniques developed to meet these practical needs would eventually contribute to advances in engineering, astronomy, and natural philosophy that characterized the early Renaissance. The collapse of traditional educational institutions forced communities to develop alternative methods for transmitting essential knowledge and skills. Craft guilds, which had previously focused primarily on economic regulation, increasingly took responsibility for training not only in technical skills, but also in basic literacy and numeracy. Master craftsmen found themselves serving as educators in ways that would have been inconceivable before the plague disrupted formal schooling systems. Women, who had traditionally been excluded from most formal educational opportunities, found new roles as teachers and knowledge keepers in this transformed landscape. With many male clergy and scholars dead, educated women often became responsible for maintaining basic literacy in their communities. Convents that had survived the plague sometimes evolved into informal schools where noble daughters and bourgeois women could receive educations that rivaled those available to men. The vernacular languages of Europe experienced rapid development during this period as Latin literacy declined among the reduced population of educated elites. Writers and scholars increasingly turned to their native tongues not only to reach broader audiences, but also because the classical educational system that had maintained Latin competence had largely collapsed. This linguistic shift accelerated the development of national literatures and cultures that would characterize the early modern period. Religious thought underwent equally profound transformations as survivors struggled to reconcile their experiences with traditional theological explanations. The doctrine of divine providence, which held that God directed all events according to a perfect plan, seemed difficult to maintain in the face of the plague's apparent randomness. Why had the pious died alongside the wicked? Why had children suffered, while criminals survived? These questions challenged fundamental assumptions about divine justice and human worthiness. New forms of religious expression emerged that emphasized individual spiritual experience over institutional authority. Mystical movements that promised direct communion with the divine gained followers among people who had lost faith in the mediating power of the established church. These movements often stressed personal revelation and emotional connection with God rather than the intellectual theological systems that had dominated medieval religious thought. The concept of purgatory, which had provided comfort to medieval Christians by suggesting that earthly suffering could reduce punishment in the afterlife, took on new significance for plague survivors. The idea that the massive suffering they had witnessed might serve a redemptive purpose offered some solace to communities grappling with incomprehensible loss. Prayers for the dead became more elaborate and frequent as survivors sought to ensure that their departed loved ones would benefit from whatever spiritual merit their earthly sufferings had earned. Popular religious practices increasingly emphasized protection against future calamities rather than preparation for eternal life. Devotional objects believed to offer protection against plague gained widespread popularity, and pilgrimage sites associated with miraculous healings attracted crowds of survivors seeking both spiritual comfort and practical insurance against future outbreaks. The transactional aspects of religious devotion became more prominent as people sought concrete benefits from their spiritual investments. The arts responded to these transformed religious sensibilities with new forms of expression that reflected both the trauma of recent experience and the hope for divine protection. Sculpture and painting began to emphasize the human aspects of divine figures, making them more accessible to audiences who had experienced profound suffering. The Virgin Mary appeared increasingly as a compassionate mother figure who understood human pain rather than as a distant symbol of perfection. Musical composition evolved to serve the needs of smaller, less formally trained congregations. The complex polyphonic masses that had characterized cathedral music gave way to simpler forms that could be performed by reduced choirs or even lay congregations. These musical changes reflected not only practical limitations but also theological shifts toward more democratic and participatory forms of worship. Architecture adapted to the changed religious landscape, with church designs that emphasized intimate community worship rather than grand ceremonial displays. Chapels and smaller churches often replaced ambitious cathedral projects that had been abandoned when their patron communities disappeared. When major construction did resume, it often incorporated elements designed to facilitate private devotion alongside public ceremony. The visual arts developed new iconographic traditions that reflected plague experiences and concerns. Images of saints associated with plague protection became more common, often depicted with specific symbols that identified their protective powers. Artistic representations of death became more realistic and psychologically complex, moving beyond stylized medieval conventions to explore the emotional and spiritual dimensions of mortality. Literature of the post-plague period increasingly explored themes of individual agency and moral responsibility in an uncertain world. Traditional narratives that emphasized divine providence and cosmic order gave way to stories that focused on human choice and consequence. Characters in these works often faced moral dilemmas without clear guidance from traditional authorities, reflecting the experiences of survivors who had to navigate ethical challenges in the absence of established social frameworks. The concept of fortune, or chance, gained prominence in literary works as writers struggled to make sense of the apparent randomness of plague mortality. Unlike earlier medieval literature, which typically portrayed worldly events as manifestations of divine will, post-plague works often depicted human fate as subject to unpredictable forces beyond divine or human control. This shift in perspective would eventually contribute to more secular worldviews that characterized Renaissance thought. Vernacular poetry flourished as writers explored themes that were difficult to express within the constraints of Latin literary conventions. The emotional directness and psychological realism that characterized much post-plague literature found natural expression in native languages that could capture the specific experiences and concerns of local communities. These poetic innovations would influence literary development throughout Europe as vernacular traditions gained respectability and sophistication. Economic thought began to evolve as survivors grappled with the practical challenges of operating in a depopulated world with transformed social relationships. Traditional theories about just prices and fair wages, which had assumed stable populations and established social hierarchies, proved inadequate for addressing the realities of labour scarcity and social mobility that characterised the post-plague economy. New approaches to understanding commercial relationships emerged that emphasised market forces rather than traditional moral principles. While medieval economic thought had focused primarily on ethical obligations between buyers and sellers, post-plague theorists increasingly recognized supply and demand as natural forces that operated independently of moral considerations. This shift in perspective laid important groundwork for later developments in economic theory. The concept of individual economic agency gained prominence as survivors discovered that their economic circumstances could change dramatically based on their own choices and efforts. Traditional medieval thought had emphasized acceptance of one's divinely appointed social position, but the post-plague world demonstrated that social mobility was not only possible, but often necessary for survival. This recognition of individual economic potential would contribute to later capitalist theories that emphasized personal initiative and market competition. Banking and finance evolved rapidly to meet the needs of a more mobile and commercially oriented society. Credit instruments became more sophisticated as merchants operated across greater distances with reduced personal networks. Insurance arrangements expanded beyond maritime ventures to cover the increased risks of conducting business in a depopulated and politically unstable environment. These financial innovations would prove crucial for supporting the commercial expansion that characterized the later medieval and early modern periods. Urban planning began to incorporate lessons learned from the plague experience, though the understanding of disease transmission remained limited. Cities that rebuilt damaged districts sometimes included wider streets and better drainage systems, changes that occasionally had beneficial effects on public health, even when they were not based on accurate medical knowledge. Market squares were often redesigned to reduce crowding, and public buildings incorporated better ventilation systems. The relationship between urban and rural areas underwent fundamental transformation as the traditional feudal obligations that had structured these connections largely disappeared. Cities that had survived the plague often found themselves in stronger positions relative to the surrounding countryside than they had enjoyed before. Urban centres began asserting greater independence from their nominal feudal overlords, developing new forms of republican government that reflected the changed balance of power between different social groups. Rural settlement patterns consolidated as survivors abandoned marginal agricultural lands and concentrated in areas with better soil and water access. Villages that had persisted for centuries in difficult locations were permanently abandoned as their populations either died or relocated to more promising sites. This consolidation created new patterns of land use that would characterize European agriculture for centuries to come, with important implications for both productivity and social organization. Agricultural techniques evolved to accommodate the changed labor situation. Farmers with access to more land but fewer workers developed new methods that emphasized labor efficiency over maximum yield. The adoption of new crops and farming practices accelerated as traditional restrictions on agricultural innovation weakened along with the feudal structures that had enforced them. These changes would contribute to the agricultural improvements that supported later population growth and economic development. The legal framework governing property relationships underwent fundamental revision as traditional communal controls weakened and individual property rights became more absolute. Courts developed new approaches to handling inheritance disputes where entire family lines had been extinguished. marriage laws where spouses had disappeared without clear evidence of death, and contract law where parties to agreements had vanished. These legal innovations reflected broader social changes in the relationships between individuals and communities. As the 1360s progressed, it became clear that Europe was not simply recovering from a temporary crisis, but had undergone a permanent transformation. The medieval world of stable hierarchies, universal authorities, and unchanging traditions had given way to a more fluid and dynamic society, characterized by social mobility, intellectual skepticism, and cultural innovation. The survivors of the Black Death had not merely rebuilt their civilization, they had created something entirely new. The children growing up in this transformed world would inherit assumptions and expectations fundamentally different from those of their grandparents. They would take for granted levels of individual freedom and social mobility that earlier generations had never imagined possible. They would inhabit a cultural landscape marked by questioning of traditional authority and openness to innovation and change. These attitudes would shape European development for centuries to come, contributing to the intellectual and cultural movements that would define the transition from medieval to modern civilization. The Black Death had served as an unwitting catalyst for changes that might otherwise have taken centuries to develop. By destroying the institutional and social structures that had maintained medieval stability, it had cleared the ground for new forms of organization and thought that would characterize the emerging modern world. The plague's victims had paid an unimaginable price for this transformation, but their survivors had inherited opportunities for human development and achievement that would have been inconceivable within the constraints of the old order. As communities continued the long process of rebuilding and adaptation, they carried within them the seeds of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and all the other movements that would ultimately lead to the world we recognize as our own. The medieval cosmos had died with the plague's victims, but from its remains had emerged the foundations of modernity itself. The greatest pandemic in human history had become, paradoxically, one of the most important catalysts for human progress and achievement. The economic disruptions caused by the Black Death reverberated through European society like ripples across a still pond, each wave bringing new transformations that would reshape the very foundations of medieval life. As survivors emerged from the immediate crisis of mass mortality, they discovered that the familiar rhythms of commerce and trade had been utterly transformed. Markets that had operated according to established patterns for centuries suddenly found themselves governed by entirely new rules, where scarcity and abundance followed patterns no merchant's grandfather could have recognized. In the workshops of Florence, where the finest cloth in Europe had once been produced through the coordinated efforts of hundreds of skilled artisans, the surviving craftsmen found themselves in a position their fathers could never have imagined. Master weavers who had once jealously guarded their techniques from potential competitors now begged young men to learn their trades, offering wages and working conditions that would have been unthinkable just years before. The guild halls that had once echoed with debates about maintaining traditional standards and restricting membership now stood half empty, their elaborate regulations meaningless when there were barely enough members to maintain basic operations. The transformation extended far beyond the immediate concerns of individual trades and crafts. The entire structure of European commerce, built over centuries of gradual development and refinement, found itself forced to adapt to circumstances that bore no resemblance to anything in historical memory. Trade routes that had connected distant cities for generations lay abandoned as their endpoints became ghost towns. Merchant families that had maintained commercial relationships across multiple generations discovered that their traditional partners had simply vanished, leaving behind empty warehouses and unfulfilled contracts. Yet from this commercial devastation emerged opportunities that would have been impossible within the rigid constraints of the pre-plague economy. Young entrepreneurs with limited capital but abundant ambition found themselves able to establish trading relationships that would have taken their predecessors decades to develop. The elaborate networks of credit and obligation that had characterized medieval commerce gave way to more flexible arrangements based on immediate needs and available resources rather than inherited relationships and traditional obligations. The Hanseatic League, that great confederation of trading cities that had dominated northern European commerce for generations, found itself forced to reinvent its fundamental operations. Cities that had been major centres of the League's activities were reduced to mere villages, while other communities that had previously been considered minor partners suddenly found themselves elevated to positions of unexpected importance. The League's traditional assemblies, where representatives from dozens of cities had once gathered to coordinate policy and resolve disputes, now struggled to maintain a quorum as entire regions fell silent. Banking houses that had survived the initial crisis through careful management of their resources discovered that they occupied positions of unprecedented influence in the transformed economic landscape. The Medici Bank, still a relatively modest operation compared to the great financial dynasties that had dominated pre-plague commerce, began expanding its operations into territories previously controlled by established competitors who had not survived the demographic catastrophe. Their success demonstrated how quickly fortune could change in a world where traditional advantages had been swept away by forces beyond human control. The monetary systems that had evolved over centuries to facilitate trade across Europe's complex political landscape faced their own crisis as the populations that had sustained them largely disappeared. Coins minted by authorities who had perished circulated in regions where no one remained who could verify their authenticity or value. The elaborate systems of exchange rates that had governed international commerce became meaningless when the cities that had established them no longer existed as functioning entities. New forms of currency began to emerge based more on practical utility than traditional authority. Silver ingots stamped with simple marks indicating weight and purity often proved more acceptable in trade than elaborate coins bearing the images of dead monarchs. Barter systems that had been largely superseded by monetary exchange during the commercial revolution of the high medieval period experienced an unexpected revival as communities struggled to conduct business without reliable access to standardized currency. The agricultural economy that formed the foundation of all medieval wealth underwent equally dramatic transformation. The careful balance between population and productive capacity that had characterized European agriculture for centuries was shattered, leaving vast areas of previously cultivated land to return to wilderness. Fields that had supported families for generations lay fallow not because of poor soil or unfavourable weather, but simply because there were no longer enough hands to work them. Surviving farmers found themselves in the unprecedented position of having access to more land than they could possibly cultivate. The traditional practice of dividing family holdings among multiple heirs gave way to consolidation as single survivors inherited estates that would have supported entire extended families in earlier times. This concentration of agricultural resources in fewer hands created opportunities for innovation and experimentation that had been impossible under the intensive cultivation methods necessitated by pre-plague population density. New crops and agricultural techniques that had previously been considered too risky or labour-intensive began to gain acceptance as farmers with abundant land but limited labour sought ways to maximise productivity per worker rather than per acre. The three-field system that had dominated European agriculture for centuries gave way to more flexible approaches that emphasized efficiency over tradition. Livestock breeding, previously constrained by limited pasture land, expanded as vast areas of former cropland were converted to grazing. The relationship between rural producers and urban consumers underwent fundamental revision as the traditional networks of obligation and exchange that had connected countryside to city largely collapsed. Peasants who had once been bound to deliver their surplus to specific lords or markets found themselves free to seek the best prices available, while urban communities that had once enjoyed reliable food supplies from traditional sources were forced to compete for agricultural products in an uncertain marketplace. These changes in agricultural organization had profound implications for European society beyond their immediate economic effects. The consolidation of landholdings contributed to the emergence of a new class of prosperous farmers who operated on a scale that bridged the traditional gap between peasant agriculture and noble estates. These agricultural entrepreneurs often possessed both the resources and the motivation to invest in improvements and innovations that would increase productivity and profitability. The construction industry, which had sustained thousands of workers across Europe through the building of cathedrals, castles, and urban infrastructure, found itself facing a crisis that went far beyond the immediate shortage of skilled craftsmen. The demographic catastrophe had eliminated many of the institutions and individuals who had commissioned major building projects, while the reduced population meant there was less need for new construction even when resources became available. Cathedral chapters that had planned construction projects spanning decades or even centuries discovered that their ambitious schemes were no longer feasible with reduced congregations and diminished resources. The great Gothic cathedrals that had been rising across Europe for generations stood incomplete, their unfinished towers serving as monuments to vanished aspirations. Work on Cologne Cathedral, one of the most ambitious architectural projects of the medieval period, ground to a halt as the craftsmen who possessed the specialized skills required for such complex construction either died or dispersed to seek employment elsewhere. Castle construction, which had been a major source of employment for skilled masons and carpenters, similarly declined as the feudal relationships that had justified such expensive fortifications weakened along with the military threats they were designed to counter. Lords who might once have invested heavily in defensive architecture found themselves ruling over territories so depopulated that fortification seemed unnecessary, while the costs of construction had increased dramatically due to labour shortages. Urban construction adapted more successfully to the changed circumstances, though often in ways that reflected the transformed social relationships of post-plague society. Houses built for the newly prosperous merchant families often incorporated architectural elements that had previously been restricted to noble residences, reflecting the breakdown of traditional sumptuary laws and social distinctions. These buildings also frequently included features designed to accommodate the changed domestic arrangements of families that often included adopted members or unrelated dependents who had joined households disrupted by plague mortality. The textile industry, which had been one of the most sophisticated and profitable sectors of the medieval economy, experienced disruptions that extended far beyond the immediate effects of reduced population. The complex supply chains that had connected wool producers in England with weavers in Flanders and dyers in Italy were shattered as key participants in these networks disappeared. The elaborate quality control systems maintained by guilds in different cities could no longer function when there were insufficient members to enforce standards or train new craftsmen. Yet the industry's recovery demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of human economic organization when traditional constraints were removed. Textile production began to decentralize as individual entrepreneurs established workshops in locations that would have been considered unsuitable under the old system. Rural areas with access to water power, but previously lacking sufficient population to support major industrial activity, attracted investment from urban capitalists seeking to escape the high labour costs and restrictive regulations of traditional manufacturing centres. New textile techniques and products emerged as craftsmen experimented with approaches that had been discouraged by guild regulations in the pre-plague period. The production of mixed fabrics combining different fibres became more common as manufacturers sought to create products that could be produced efficiently with limited skilled labour. These innovations often proved popular with consumers whose changed circumstances created demand for different types of clothing and household textiles. The metalworking industries that had supplied everything from agricultural tools to military equipment found themselves facing the dual challenge of reduced demand and increased labour costs. Blacksmiths who had once served specific communities discovered that they needed to expand their territory and range of services to maintain viable businesses. The specialised craftsmen who had produced luxury items for noble and ecclesiastical customers often found their traditional markets had largely disappeared. However, the increased wages that characterised the post-plague economy created new opportunities for metalworkers who could adapt their skills to serve emerging markets. Successful farmers and merchants who had prospered in the transformed economic landscape often sought to display their newfound wealth through the acquisition of metal goods that had previously been available only to traditional elites. This demand supported the development of new production techniques that emphasized efficiency and affordability over the elaborate craftsmanship that had characterized pre-plague luxury metalwork. Mining operations throughout Europe faced particular challenges as the dangerous and labour-intensive nature of extractive work made it difficult to attract sufficient workers, even at elevated wages. Many mines that had operated profitably for generations were abandoned not because their ore deposits were exhausted, but because the costs of extraction had become prohibitive. Silver mines in the German territories and iron mines in England and France ceased operations as their owners found it impossible to maintain adequate labour forces. The reduction in metal production had cascading effects throughout the European economy, as the availability of materials for everything from coins to construction hardware became more limited and expensive. This scarcity encouraged innovation in metalworking techniques as craftsmen sought ways to accomplish their work with less raw material, leading to developments in alloy composition and manufacturing processes that would prove valuable in subsequent periods of increased production. Maritime commerce, which had been crucial for connecting Europe's scattered regions and linking the continent to broader international trade networks, experienced disruption and transformation that reflected both the immediate effects of population loss and the broader changes in economic organisation. Port cities that had thrived as centres of international trade found their populations decimated and their commercial infrastructure damaged or abandoned. The complex networks of relationships between ship owners, merchants, and financiers that had sustained long-distance trade required reconstruction with new participants who often lacked the experience and connections of their predecessors. Yet maritime trade also demonstrated remarkable resilience, as survivors recognized the continuing importance of sea routes for accessing goods and markets that were no longer available through traditional overland networks. Ship construction techniques evolved to accommodate smaller crews while maintaining cargo capacity, leading to innovations in rigging and navigation that would prove valuable for future maritime expansion. The reduced competition among surviving port cities often allowed them to capture trade that had previously been distributed among multiple competitors. Navigation techniques improved as sailors found themselves operating with reduced crews and less experienced colleagues, necessitating the development of more systematic approaches to maritime travel. The use of written sailing directions and coastal charts became more common as oral traditions that had been maintained by experienced mariners were lost along with their carriers. These improvements in navigational knowledge would prove crucial for the later age of exploration as European maritime technology continued to advance. The fishing industry, which had provided protein for both coastal and inland populations, faced the challenge of maintaining operations with reduced labour forces while serving markets that had been dramatically altered by demographic change. Fishing communities that had once supplied specific urban markets often found those cities largely depopulated, forcing them to seek new outlets for their catch or to reduce their operations to serve only local needs. However, the increased purchasing power of plague survivors often created opportunities for fishing operations that could adapt to serve markets for higher quality products. Fresh fish that had previously been luxury items became more accessible to the newly prosperous survivors, supporting the development of more sophisticated preservation and transportation techniques that allowed fishing communities to serve customers across greater distances. The salt industry, crucial for food preservation and essential for maintaining fish and meat supplies through seasons when fresh food was unavailable, experienced both challenges and opportunities in the post-plague economy. Salt production sites that had relied on large labour forces for the intensive work of extracting and refining salt found themselves struggling to maintain operations. However, the increased value of preserved foods in a world where transportation networks were disrupted created strong demand for salt among those who could afford it. Innovation in salt production techniques accelerated as producers sought ways to maintain output with reduced labour inputs. The use of improved evaporation techniques and more efficient processing methods allowed some salt works to continue operating profitably despite higher labour costs. These technological improvements would prove valuable as European salt production expanded in later periods to meet both domestic needs and the demands of international trade. The leather industry, which had supplied everything from shoes and clothing to bookbindings and military equipment, faced particular challenges as the reduction in livestock numbers that accompanied agricultural changes limited the availability of raw materials. Tanners, who had once enjoyed steady supplies of hides from local sources, found themselves competing for limited materials while serving markets that had been transformed by demographic change. Yet the leather industry also demonstrated the adaptability that characterized many sectors of the post-plague economy. Craftsmen began working with different types of skins and developing new tanning techniques that could produce usable leather from materials that had previously been considered unsuitable. The increased wealth of many survivors created demand for higher quality leather goods, supporting the development of more sophisticated production techniques and decorative treatments. The transformation of European commerce during and after the Black Death represented more than a temporary disruption, followed by gradual recovery. Instead, it marked the emergence of fundamentally new approaches to economic organization that would characterize the transition from medieval to early modern economic systems. The rigid guild structures and traditional trade relationships that had defined medieval commerce gave way to more flexible arrangements that emphasized individual initiative and market responsiveness over inherited privilege and customary obligation. These changes in commercial organization had profound implications for European society beyond their immediate economic effects. The increased social mobility that characterized the post-plague economy contributed to the breakdown of traditional class distinctions and the emergence of new forms of social organization based more on wealth and achievement than on hereditary status. The emphasis on individual economic initiative that became necessary for survival in the transformed marketplace would eventually contribute to the development of capitalist economic theory and practice. The international scope of commercial transformation also had important political implications, as traditional relationships between different regions and kingdoms were disrupted and reconstituted. Trade networks that had operated according to established diplomatic and commercial agreements found themselves forced to adapt to new political realities, as the authorities who had negotiated those agreements often no longer existed. This created opportunities for new political relationships and economic partnerships that would reshape the balance of power across Europe. As the 1360s progressed into the 1370s, it became increasingly clear that the commercial transformation initiated by the Black Death was not a temporary aberration, but a permanent shift toward new forms of economic organization. The survivors of the Great Mortality had not simply rebuilt the medieval economy, they had created something entirely different that would serve as the foundation for the commercial revolution that would characterize the later medieval and early modern periods. The children growing up in this transformed commercial environment would inherit economic opportunities and challenges that would have been incomprehensible to their grandparents. They would operate in markets governed by competition and innovation rather than tradition and regulation. They would pursue economic strategies based on individual initiative and calculated risk rather than inherited obligation and customary practice. These changed attitudes toward commerce and economic activity would prove crucial for supporting the cultural and intellectual developments that would define the Renaissance and the emergence of early modern European civilization. The transformation of daily life for ordinary Europeans during the decades following the Black Death revealed itself not in grand political gestures or sweeping economic policies, but in countless small adaptations that collectively reshaped the texture of human existence. In farmhouses scattered across the French countryside, surviving peasants found themselves sleeping in beds that had once housed entire families, their solitary meals echoing in kitchens designed for bustling households. The very rhythms of rural life, dictated for centuries by communal labour and shared obligations, gave way to more individualised patterns as survivors learned to manage tasks that had previously required coordinated effort from multiple hands. Village churches that had once overflowed with congregations now seemed cavernous, their empty pews serving as wooden monuments to vanished communities. Parish priests, when they could be found at all, often served multiple villages, travelling circuits that would have been unthinkable when each settlement had supported its own clergyman. The elaborate feast days and religious processions that had marked the seasonal calendar for generations were simplified or abandoned entirely, as there were simply too few participants to maintain traditional celebrations. Wedding ceremonies that had once brought together extended networks of family and neighbours became intimate affairs involving only immediate survivors. The complex negotiations over dowries and marriage settlements that had characterised pre-plague unions gave way to more pragmatic arrangements between individuals who often possessed more property than their parents could have dreamed of, but lacked the extensive kinship networks that had traditionally arranged such matters. Young women found themselves inheriting estates and businesses that previous generations would never have entrusted to female management, while young men discovered opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible within the rigid hierarchies of the old order. Household management underwent equally dramatic transformation as domestic arrangements adapted to changed circumstances. Servants who had once occupied clearly defined positions within elaborate hierarchies now found themselves performing multiple roles, moving fluidly between tasks that had previously been strictly segregated by rank and gender. The great households of surviving nobles often functioned more like extended families than formal establishments, with traditional distinctions between masters and servants blurred by shared experiences of loss and mutual dependence for survival. The preparation and consumption of food reflected broader social changes, as traditional communal dining arrangements gave way to more individualized patterns. Meals that had once served to reinforce social hierarchies through elaborate protocols of service and precedence became simpler affairs where practical considerations outweighed ceremonial requirements. The scarcity of certain foods led to experimentation with ingredients and cooking techniques that would have been considered beneath notice in more prosperous times, while the abundance of others created opportunities for indulgence that had previously been restricted to the wealthy elite. Clothing and personal appearance evolved to reflect the changed social landscape as traditional sumptuary laws became unenforceable and new forms of wealth sought visible expression. Survivors who had inherited the wardrobes of deceased relatives often found themselves wearing garments that would have been inappropriate to their original social station, while successful artisans and merchants began adopting styles of dress that had previously been restricted to the nobility. The textile shortages that characterized much of the post-plague period encouraged innovation in clothing design and construction techniques, leading to new fashions that emphasized durability and adaptability over elaborate ornamentation. Urban life in the surviving cities took on entirely different characteristics, as neighborhoods that had once teemed with activity became partially abandoned. Streets that had been centers of commercial and social activity stood half empty, with weeds growing between cobblestones where market stalls had once clustered. Yet this apparent decline masked important transformations in how urban space was organized and used. Surviving residents often found themselves with access to larger living quarters as they occupied buildings abandoned by plague victims, while reduced population density allowed for improvements in sanitation and public health that would have been impossible under pre-plague conditions. The guild halls that had once regulated urban economic life stood as monuments to vanished certainties, their elaborate ceremonial chambers echoing with the absence of members who would never return. The surviving guild members found themselves forced to abandon many traditional restrictions and regulations simply to maintain their organization's existence. Apprenticeship systems that had once required years of training were compressed into shorter periods, as master craftsmen struggled to pass on essential skills before they too might succumb to age or disease. Educational practices evolved dramatically as the institutional structures that had supported formal learning largely collapsed. Monastery schools that had educated generations of young men stood empty or were reduced to a handful of elderly monks who could no longer maintain comprehensive curricula. University towns that had attracted students from across Europe found their lecture halls deserted and their libraries gathering dust as both teachers and pupils had perished or dispersed. Yet education persisted in new forms adapted to changed circumstances. Wealthy merchant families increasingly hired private tutors to educate their children, creating demand for scholars who might have struggled to find employment within traditional institutional frameworks. Women who had received education in convents before the plague often found themselves serving as teachers for children whose families had been disrupted by mortality, creating informal educational networks that transcended traditional gender boundaries. The transmission of practical knowledge became particularly important as traditional apprenticeship systems struggled to function with reduced numbers of both masters and students. Surviving craftsmen often found themselves compelled to record their techniques in written form to ensure that essential skills would not be lost if they died before finding suitable apprentices. This documentation of previously oral traditions contributed to the gradual improvement and systematization of technical knowledge across various trades and professions. Musical and artistic traditions adapted to serve the needs of smaller and more intimate communities. The elaborate polyphonic compositions that had characterized cathedral music gave way to simpler forms that could be performed by reduced choirs or even lay congregations. Folk music traditions flourished as communities sought forms of cultural expression that did not require extensive institutional support or formal training. Traveling musicians and storytellers found receptive audiences among survivors hungry for entertainment and news from the wider world. Visual arts evolved to reflect both the trauma of recent experience and the changed social relationships of post-plague society. Religious art increasingly emphasized themes of mortality and divine mercy, with images of saints and biblical figures depicted in more human and emotionally accessible ways. Secular art began to focus more on individual portraits and domestic scenes, reflecting the increased importance of personal and family identity in a world where traditional community structures had been disrupted. Architecture evolved to accommodate the changed needs and resources of post-plague communities. Churches built or renovated during this period often featured more intimate spaces designed for smaller congregations, while residential architecture increasingly emphasized comfort and privacy over the communal arrangements that had characterized earlier periods. The availability of abandoned buildings and building materials from demolished structures allowed for architectural experimentation that would have been prohibitively expensive under normal circumstances. The practice of medicine, though still limited by primitive understanding of disease mechanisms, began to incorporate lessons learned from plague experience. Physicians who had survived the pandemic often developed more pragmatic approaches to treatment that emphasized patient comfort and symptom management over theoretical adherence to ancient medical authorities. The recognition that certain practices seemed to improve survival rates, even when the reasons were not understood, led to gradual improvements in hygiene and patient care. Burial practices and attitudes toward death underwent significant transformation as communities struggled to cope with unprecedented mortality. Traditional funeral rites that had emphasized elaborate ceremony and extended mourning periods gave way to simpler observances adapted to circumstances where entire families might have perished simultaneously. Cemetery design evolved to accommodate mass burials while still maintaining some recognition of individual identity, leading to innovations in memorial practices that would influence European funerary traditions for centuries. The relationship between generations changed dramatically as many families found themselves reduced to single survivors who bore the responsibility for maintaining family traditions and property without the guidance of elders or the support of siblings. Young adults who might have spent years learning family trades or businesses under parental supervision were forced to assume full responsibility immediately, often inheriting skills and knowledge that had been passed down through generations but which they had to apply without experienced guidance. Marriage patterns evolved as traditional arrangements based on family alliances and property consolidation gave way to more personal choices made by individuals who often possessed greater independence and resources than their parents' generation could have imagined. The abundance of available land and property meant that young couples could establish independent households without the extended negotiations and compromises that had characterized earlier marriage arrangements. Child-rearing practices adapted to circumstances where many children were raised by surviving relatives or family friends rather than their biological parents. This created more flexible approaches to family structure and child development, as communities recognized the need to provide support and guidance for children whose traditional family networks had been disrupted. The educational and social development of these children often reflected a blend of influences from multiple families and communities. Religious observance became more personal and less institutional as communities developed their own approaches to maintaining spiritual life in the absence of adequate clerical supervision. Family prayers and private devotions gained importance as supplements to or substitutes for formal church services. The reading of religious texts in vernacular languages increased as communities sought to maintain their faith traditions without depending entirely on Latin-educated clergy. Social celebrations and community festivals evolved to serve the needs of smaller and more scattered populations. Harvest festivals and seasonal celebrations that had once involved entire villages were often consolidated into regional gatherings that brought together survivors from multiple communities. These events served important social functions beyond mere entertainment, providing opportunities for young people to meet potential marriage partners and for communities to maintain connections across larger geographic areas. The administration of justice adapted to circumstances where traditional legal authorities had often perished or fled. Community leaders who had survived the plague frequently found themselves serving as informal magistrates and mediators, developing practical approaches to resolving disputes and maintaining order without the elaborate legal procedures that had characterized pre-plague judicial systems. These adaptations often emphasized restoration and community harmony over punishment and formal legal precedent. Economic relationships within communities became more flexible and cooperative as survivors recognized their mutual dependence for basic survival needs. Barter systems and mutual aid arrangements flourished as communities developed networks of reciprocal obligation that transcended traditional class boundaries. The sharing of tools, livestock, and labour became common practices that helped individual families accomplish tasks that would have been impossible working alone. As the 1370s progressed into the 1380s, these countless individual adaptations began to coalesce into recognisable new patterns of social organisation that would characterise post-plague European society. The children who grew up in this transformed world would inherit assumptions about individual agency, social mobility, and community cooperation that differed fundamentally from those of their grandparents. Their experiences would shape European cultural development for generations to come, contributing to the intellectual and social movements that would define the transition from medieval to early modern civilization. The daily life of plague survivors thus reflected in microcosm the broader transformation of European society. Through countless small adjustments and innovations, ordinary people created new ways of living that preserved essential human values while adapting to circumstances that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. These adaptations represented not merely survival strategies, but the foundation stones of a new social order that would emerge from the ruins of the medieval world. The emergence of a new social order from the ashes of medieval certainty was not a sudden transformation, but rather a gradual awakening that unfolded across generations. As communities slowly rebuilt their shattered world, they discovered that the very concepts of authority, tradition, and social obligation had been fundamentally altered by their shared experience of catastrophe. The survivors who had witnessed the collapse of every institution they had once considered eternal now approached life with a mixture of pragmatic skepticism and cautious hope that would define European consciousness for centuries to come. In the countryside of England, where ancient manor houses stood like islands in seas of abandoned fields, a new relationship between land and labour was taking shape. Peasants who had once bowed their heads when speaking to their lords now looked them directly in the eye, negotiating terms of employment with the confidence of people who knew their work was essential and their alternatives abundant. The traditional harvest celebrations that had once reinforced social hierarchies through elaborate rituals of deference were replaced by more egalitarian gatherings where master and servant shared the same tables and raised the same toasts to successful crops. These rural transformations rippled outward into the towns and cities, where the rigid guild structures that had regulated every aspect of commercial life were giving way to more fluid arrangements. Young entrepreneurs discovered they could establish themselves in trades that would have taken their fathers decades to enter, while master craftsmen found themselves competing for workers who could choose among multiple opportunities. The workshops of London and Paris began to hum with a different energy, one driven by innovation and competition rather than tradition and restriction. The intellectual landscape of Europe was undergoing an equally profound transformation as scholars and thinkers grappled with questions that previous generations had never needed to ask. In the universities that had survived the plague, debates raged about the nature of divine providence and human agency. How could a just God permit such seemingly random suffering? What did individual merit mean in a world where survival often depended more on chance than virtue. These theological discussions spilled over into philosophy, law, and natural science, creating an atmosphere of intellectual ferment that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. Women found themselves occupying roles that would have been unthinkable in the rigid hierarchies of the pre-plague world. Widows who had inherited their husbands' businesses discovered they possessed both the acumen and the authority to expand those enterprises beyond anything their spouses had achieved. Daughters who might have been destined for convents or arranged marriages suddenly found themselves managing estates, negotiating contracts, and making decisions that affected entire communities. This expansion of female authority would prove to be one of the most enduring legacies of the demographic catastrophe. The religious life of Europe was being reshaped from the ground up as communities developed new forms of spiritual expression that reflected their transformed circumstances. The elaborate ceremonial traditions that had required large congregations and extensive clerical hierarchies were simplified or abandoned in favor of more intimate practices that emphasized personal devotion over institutional authority. Mystical movements that promised direct communion with the divine gained followers among people who had lost faith in the mediating power of traditional religious structures. Art and literature began to reflect these changing sensibilities with unprecedented emotional directness and psychological complexity. The stylized figures and symbolic representations that had characterized medieval artistic expression gave way to more realistic portrayals of human experience. Writers began exploring themes of individual responsibility and moral choice in ways that acknowledged the complexity and ambiguity of human existence rather than simply reinforcing traditional moral teachings. The economic transformation of Europe accelerated as new forms of commercial organization emerged to serve the needs of a more mobile and individualistic society. Banking houses developed sophisticated credit instruments that allowed merchants to operate across greater distances with reduced personal networks. Insurance arrangements expanded to cover risks that had previously been considered acts of God beyond human control. The very concept of economic planning began to shift from acceptance of divine will to active human agency in shaping material circumstances. Urban planning reflected these changed priorities as cities rebuilt their damaged districts with wider streets, better drainage, and more spacious public areas. The crowded, chaotic arrangements that had characterized medieval urban centers gave way to more organized layouts that prioritized public health and commercial efficiency over traditional considerations of defense and social hierarchy. These improvements in urban design would prove crucial for supporting the population growth and economic expansion that would characterize later periods. The educational systems that emerged from the ruins of medieval institutions emphasized practical knowledge and critical thinking over rote memorization of traditional authorities. Students learned to question inherited wisdom and to develop their own approaches to understanding the natural world. This shift in educational philosophy would prove essential for supporting the scientific revolution and the broader intellectual developments that would define the early modern period. Marriage and family life evolved to accommodate the increased individual autonomy that characterized post-plague society. Young people gained greater freedom to choose their own partners based on personal compatibility rather than family alliance or economic advantage. The nuclear family began to emerge as the basic unit of social organization, replacing the extended kinship networks that had previously governed most aspects of personal life. The legal systems of Europe adapted to serve the needs of a more individualistic and commercially oriented society. Property rights became more absolute as traditional communal controls weakened. Contract law evolved to handle the complex commercial relationships that characterized the new economy. Criminal justice began to emphasize individual responsibility and proportionate punishment rather than collective obligation and ritualized compensation. Regional differences in recovery patterns created new dynamics of competition and cooperation between different areas of Europe. Regions that had maintained their populations and institutional structures found themselves at an advantage in the immediate aftermath of the plague, but areas that underwent more complete transformation often proved more adaptable to changing circumstances in the longer term. These variations in development would contribute to the political and economic competition that would characterize early modern European history. The demographic recovery that began in the late 14th century proceeded unevenly across Europe, with some regions regaining their pre-plague population levels within generations, while others remained depopulated for centuries. This uneven recovery created new patterns of migration and settlement as people moved from areas of relative scarcity to regions offering greater opportunities. The resulting population movements helped to spread the social and cultural innovations that had emerged in different areas during the immediate post-plague period. Technological innovation accelerated as communities with reduced labor forces sought more efficient methods for accomplishing essential tasks. Agricultural techniques improved as farmers experimented with new crops and cultivation methods. Manufacturing processes became more sophisticated as craftsmen developed tools and procedures that allowed smaller workforces to maintain previous levels of production. These technological advances would prove crucial for supporting the economic growth that characterized the later medieval and early modern periods. The international trade networks that had been disrupted by the plague gradually reconstituted themselves along new lines that reflected the changed political and economic landscape of Europe. Maritime commerce expanded as surviving port cities captured trade that had previously been distributed among multiple competitors. Overland trade routes shifted to accommodate new centers of production and consumption. These commercial developments contributed to the gradual integration of European markets that would support later economic expansion. Cultural exchange accelerated as communities that had been isolated by traditional social and political boundaries found themselves connected by new networks of trade, migration, and communication. Ideas and innovations that might once have remained confined to particular regions spread rapidly across Europe as people moved more freely and communicated more directly. This cultural diffusion would prove essential for the intellectual and artistic developments that would characterize the Renaissance. As the 14th century drew to a close, it became clear that Europe had not simply recovered from the Black Death, but had been transformed by it into something entirely new. The medieval world of stable hierarchies, universal authorities, and unchanging traditions had given way to a more dynamic and individualistic society that would serve as the foundation for all subsequent European developments. The plague survivors had not merely rebuilt their civilization, they had created the modern world. The children who grew up in this transformed Europe would inherit opportunities for personal advancement and intellectual achievement that would have been inconceivable to their great-grandparents. They would live in societies that valued innovation over tradition, individual merit over inherited status, and empirical observation over received authority. These values would shape European civilization for centuries to come, contributing to the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and all the other movements that would define the transition to modernity. The Black Death had claimed perhaps 50 million lives across Europe, but from the ashes of that unprecedented catastrophe had emerged the foundations of the modern world. The greatest pandemic in human history had become, paradoxically, one of the most important catalysts for human progress and cultural achievement. As survivors finally drifted towards sleep in their transformed world, they carried within them the seeds of all the magnificent and terrible developments that would flow from their hard-won survival. The medieval cosmos had died with the plague's victims, but from its remains had emerged something entirely new. A world where individuals could shape their own destinies, where knowledge could advance through observation and experiment, where social boundaries could be crossed through merit and effort. It was a world that would have been unrecognizable to the people who had lived before the plague, but it was also a world that would give birth to achievements in art, science, philosophy, and human organization that would have been impossible under the constraints of the old order. In the quiet villages and bustling cities of late 14th century Europe, as candles flickered in windows and fires settled into glowing embers, the survivors of history's greatest catastrophe settled into sleep. They could not have known that they were the inheritors and creators of modernity itself, that their struggles and adaptations had laid the groundwork for everything we recognize as the beginning of our own historical era. But perhaps in their dreams, they glimpsed something of the extraordinary world their descendants would build from the fragments of their shattered medieval cosmos.